Inside California Politics with Fred Keeley, a periodic offering of the California State University, Monterey Bay's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute program. This is a bit more than a decade into the program. We are very pleased that the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute continues to support this outreach and information for California's citizens, and especially here in the Monterey Bay area. From Los Angeles, visiting his family in LA and carving out an hour for us is my good friend, Darrell Steinberg. Darrell, how are you, sir?
Fred, it's great to be with you. It was honored to serve with you, and all these years later to be together. I'm thrilled to have a little time. I am in a hotel here in Los Angeles, visiting family down here for a wedding. And so, I didn't quite dress in a suit and tie, but you got me as I am. So,
well, having you how you are is pretty damn good. So I'm good with that. I'm good with that. So maybe we could start with this, Darrell. I wanted to go over a couple of issues that are very predictable here, and a couple that you have done more than just a little bit of work on. I want to start with the issues around what emerged a couple of years ago as what was called the Black Lives Matter world that we are in following the George Floyd murder, and in big cities all over the United States, the reactions to that. And then I know that you had a case that got more than a little bit of publicity around a shooting of a Black man in your city. So you have experienced the issues around race and class in your city. And yet, from my observations, you are in a very collaborative way, working through in a sincere way at the heart of these issues. And I wonder if you might share some of that with us.
Sure. Let me provide just a little bit of perspective that relates a little bit to the arc of my own public service career and gets right to the heart of your question. When I ran for mayor of the city of Sacramento, capital city, long been considered a government town, the city's changing in dramatic ways. It's becoming a much larger, much more cosmopolitan city, much more focused on building a broader and diverse economy. I thought mistakenly that after my tenure as in the legislature, including those years as Senate leader, helping lead through the worst recession in modern history in California, that being mayor of the city would be not easy, but would be relatively easier than what I had experienced in the legislature. And it's turned out to be exactly the opposite. And I think when I try to reflect on why that is, there are several reasons. And one of them is that the times they are changing. There is a reckoning that is taking place in our society, and an appropriate reckoning around issues which have long been if not ignored, not given proper attention. And those are the issues of racial and economic equity. And I put it this way, cities are what I call municipal corporations. Cities traditionally have had the obligation to collect the taxpayer money and then provide direct and basic services to the people, mostly public safety, police and fire, parks, utilities. We do the basics. What's happening in this era is that the people are rightfully demanding that cities be much more than just basic service providers. They want us to invest directly in what I call inclusive economic development, in forgotten areas of our city, in racial equity, in workforce development, in youth, in affordable housing, and of course, homelessness. And that has created a real point of inflection, because cities traditionally do not have the funding base to do all of that. What I've tried to do as the mayor of this city is say that we must lean in and we must add to what we consider to be core priorities for the city. Because if we are not leading on reducing the economic divide in addressing the generational impacts of redlining in our city and overt discrimination, then we are not leading in the right way. And so it has been a struggle because there have been there's a lot of support for moving in new directions when it comes to an investment strategy for our city. But there's a lot of pushback because the traditional interests, the police and fire unions, for example, say, well, wait a minute. Traditional public safety is still the most important thing that a city can do. And it's waxed and waned. After the killing of Stephon Clark, who was a shooting of an unarmed African-American man by two officers in his grandmother's backyard. In fairness, it was a very ambiguous situation because the officers did not know that he was in his grandmother's backyard and he had been acting in inappropriate ways in the moments leading up to his shooting. But it was a national story. And then, of course, the George Floyd story. We were forced to confront all of these issues, not only on the economic front, but also the relationship between our police force and our communities, especially our communities of color. And we made a significant number of reforms, independent inspector general to investigate officer-involved shootings. We set up a whole new department of non-law enforcement response to 911 calls that didn't involve underlying criminal activity, and moving very clear in a progressive direction. And then over the last year or two, post-COVID, as crime rates have increased, there are those at least trying to swing the pendulum the other way, to say that no, we must invest more in police services, less of this investment in communities. We've got to get back to the basics. And so the outcome is not yet played out. And I have almost 3 years left in my term around how far and we can move the arc of the city towards a more, what I call, progressive investment strategy in our communities, as opposed to spending all the money on what cities traditionally have done and still do.
For those of you who don't know, but this is probably not a news flash to anybody here, Darrell and I are both Democrats. And I think that portion of the Democratic Party who decided that the phrase defund the police made any sense, it's a pretty bad thing to do.
Stupid.
There we go. Let's just call it stupid. That'll work.
Stupid. Yes.
So in your city, when you were talking just now about your budget, here's what I thought I heard, was that in addition to funding the police, you are doing other activities,
yes,
that may not need necessarily the first responder to be an officer or an officer plus someone. Can you talk more about that? Because
sure.
I don't think that there is some, big cities are run by Democrats. There's no mystery about that.
So defund the police was, maybe it's a little harsh to say it was stupid, but it was a mistake because it was ideological and was not reflective of where the majority of the people stand, including myself. I don't think police are bad. I always say that if you have a conversation with a young police officer and you have a conversation an hour later with a young activist of color who is very critical of the police, you'll leave both those conversations believing that they're both right, because everybody is a product of their own experience. Policing is it's a dangerous profession. There's no question about it. And the men and women who go into policing are largely dedicated to trying to help people. Having said that, The real debate ought to be, and it is the debate we are having in my city, is not whether to defund the police, but whether and how to redefine what we expect of the 21st century police officer.
Mhm.
And that's where this idea of a differential response to calls that come through the 911 system, for example, really matter. I think we've put police in largely an unfair and untenable situation. We expect them to be the first responder to every single situation in our community. We expect them to be the first responder when there's a fight in a homeless camp, first responder for every domestic violence situation. Of course, domestic violence is a crime, so sometimes it's appropriate. We expect them to diffuse any crisis situation in the community. And it's unfair to them, and frankly is not effective. They should be responding to crime because that's what they're real crime, because that's what they're trained to do. We have established, as I said a moment ago, a new Department of Community Response, and it is going to take 5 years to evolve to what we want it to be, because none of this happens overnight. We're through the 911 system, and now there's a new national mental health number, 988, where we are going to deploy social workers, people trained in crisis outreach without a gun and a badge to these situations and keep the police out of it unless they have to be involved in it. And I think it provides the most potential for a more effective response to crisis situations in our communities. But also, to me, it's the broader answer to the police reform question. Because what happens in so many of these situations, take somebody who is dealing with a mental health crisis in the community. So many of these officer-involved shootings, frankly, involve people who are in the midst of a psychiatric crisis. You look at this, you look at the studies, that's exactly what happens in not all, but many of these situations. Well, think about how traumatizing it is for someone who's in the middle of a crisis, who may have a history with the police, may have a significant amount of distrust with the police, to be confronted in the midst of psychiatric crisis with somebody with a uniform, a baton, a badge, and a gun. You're asking for a tragedy. You're asking for it. On the other hand, you send out somebody who's clinically trained in how to diffuse a situation involving somebody who's really hurting. You don't have that threat, and you're much more likely to be able to help the person actually navigate to whatever help they need. That's the future of police reform. In addition to getting back to, it's a cliche a little bit, but getting back to more genuine community policing model, where police officers are hired from the community. They represent the diversity of the community, and they actually know the people that they are serving, as opposed to just patrolling relatively anonymously. That, I believe, is the better route than defunding. And that's where modern American cities are moving. That's where we're moving. Now, the stasis around the pace of change, I have found to be the most difficult part of my job as mayor, especially because under our system, I don't have clear executive authority or implementation authority. So I do what I did in the legislature, which is I know how to put together a majority. I put the votes together. I have a vision. I establish the policy and let the implementation begin. And that takes more time, where the real work actually has to get done. But that's the direction we're moving in.
It's turning out, at least here in Santa Cruz, both the city and the county, and I'm hearing this from mayors and supervisors and so on from throughout the state, and that is the difficulty in recruiting into law enforcement right now. Are you finding it difficult to recruit in your city with regard to police officers?
Absolutely. We cannot hire police officers fast enough. Even for positions that we have budgeted. And I do think it speaks to the delicacy of and the sensitivity of the moment that we're living in. The challenge is, how do you push for reform, especially where everything is not right around traditional policing, which it isn't? How do you push for reform and at the same time not kill off the profession because nobody wants to put on a uniform when they know that their every act, even in good faith, is likely to be highly scrutinized and questioned. And so it's very real. And the only way to do it is to be honest about it, in my view, and to be very clear about where we want to go and have good leadership. We've had good police chiefs in Sacramento. We had the first African-American police chief who grew up in Sacramento, was the police chief during most of my tenure. He retired. Now we have the first female police chief in the city's history. Both of them have the respect and support of the rank and file, and at the same time, they are respected in the community. And so imperfectly, they are trying to answer the very challenge that I just put forward. How do we modernize the police? How do we, frankly, encourage the old guard to retire who aren't interested in change, and at the same time make policing attractive for young people who have a career choice? It's pretty amazing to meet police officers today, young police officers. I mean, these are kids. So they're 22, 23, 24, 25. I mean, we had a shooting, a suspect shot at a number of our officers. Thank God they missed, but it was a real close call. And I called them and they were all in their 20s and most of them in their early 20s. And so we are putting a lot of responsibility onto very, very young people, and guiding them in the right way is important.
I consider the homeless issue the modern stain on our civil society.
No question.
In this country. And I think it's a compound, complex issue. I'd like to get into some of it with you. I know that your city, I know that you in particular and your city in particular are doing a number of things. Let's focus for a second here on those experiencing homelessness. How the city, how our capital city is dealing with that very compound, complex challenge.
It is a complex challenge. And of course, in the legislature, I had a lot of formative experience around trying to fix California's mental health system and authored the Millionaire's Tax, Proposition 63. I often say, now generating, by the way, $3.8 billion a year for public mental health services. But I often say that if I knew back in 2004, when we worked together, Fred, that I knew I was going to run for mayor of Sacramento 12 years later, I might have written that proposition to direct more of that money to cities as opposed to counties. But that's the way it is. And it's a joke, but it's half serious because
no, I understand.
Because one of the dilemmas here is that the core of the homeless problem is in our urban centers, not all of it. And cities, as I described earlier, are not health and human services agencies or mental health agencies, it's the counties. And the cities are the most visible, the mayor of the city is most visible. And I frankly ran in part creating an expectation that I was going to be able to move the needle. And we have leaned in like never before. We've gone from several hundred shelter beds to 1,100 shelter beds a night in the city now, which is significant. And yet the problem is significantly worse. COVID and early jail releases and housing affordability. There's not a single reason for homelessness. But frankly, in my city and county and throughout the state, despite all the talk about collaboration, what we really have here is a systems failure. I have kind of a radical thought on all of this that I have been promoting and advocating for now going on 3 years. And I put it this way: name another area of major public concern where everything that government at all levels is called upon to do is voluntary or optional. We don't say it is optional or voluntary to provide a free public education to kids or to build public schools. We mandate it, and it's actually part of our culture. Climate change, we did not say that it's optional or voluntary for the public and private sector to substitute renewable energy for fossil fuels. We mandated ever increasing production standards. And it sent a market signal both to the public and private sector that we expect to increase our renewable energy utilization. I think this society cries crocodile tears, frankly, when it comes to housing and homelessness and mental health care. Because when it comes to housing, when it comes to shelter, when it comes to mental health care for the most vulnerable, everything that government does is optional and voluntary. There is no requirement or mandate that cities and counties work together. There is no legal right to housing. There is no legal right to mental health treatment. It is all based upon the efforts of leaders and systems, which frankly only respond urgently to that which is required. And it sounds harsh, but it's absolutely true. It isn't that there isn't good work going on in our communities. There is.
Yes.
But there is no mandate or no requirement. And I believe that there ought to be a legal right to housing in California and a legal right to shelter. Now, what does that mean? Or what are you talking about? If you had an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper in front of you and you drew a line down the middle of it, and on the left column, you said requirements to build housing. And on the right side, you had obstacles to build housing.
Okay.
On the right-hand side, you would have a long list.
Yes.
Overregulation, not in my backyard, excessive local control, cost, lack of housing innovation, why we aren't doing more manufactured housing and more expeditiously and less expensively than $500,000 or more per unit for subsidized housing is insane. But you would have a long list, all right? On the left-hand side, when it comes to requirement to build housing, you would have what I would describe charitably as a weak state housing element law that only requires cities and counties to plan for enough housing without any production standard. Now, if there were a legal right to housing that was truly enforceable, I guarantee you that courts would insist that those obstacles on the right-hand side, especially excessive local control and not in my backyard, would have to give way to the legal requirement. There is no counterforce currently. And so all of the excuses for why we aren't producing enough affordable housing or shelter for the homeless prevail in large part because the systems are not required to overcome them. I believe this. I know it like I've known nothing else in my 30 years of public life, that unless we require what we know is necessary. Let me talk about mental health for a minute, Fred. Let's go back in history. In 1977, Frank Lanterman, who was a legend in his time, passed the bill that began shutting the state developmental centers. I'm not talking about the mental hospitals, the developmental centers for those with developmental disabilities. In another era, now very politically incorrect, people were known as mentally retarded, but it's developmental disabilities. When they passed that law in 1977, the state was very clear in granting a legal entitlement to people for lifetime service, housing, and whatever it took to make sure that people with developmental disabilities could live independently as possible in the community. Good and great. And now we have a system of regional centers that actually ensure that people are cared for. Back up 10 years, 1967. The same Frank Lanterman was the lead author on the Lanterman-Petra Short Act, the so-called 5150 law. This was shutting the state mental hospitals, the deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals. And they presumed that we would use the money saved from the closure of the hospitals to build a decent system of community care. Here's what they didn't do. They did not grant people with serious mental illness an entitlement to service. And I think you go back to that differentiation and you see the core and the root of at least a significant part of our homeless problem in California, because no counties are not required to get out into those tent encampments. They are not required to open mental health clinics. They are not required to fund that mental health system. Now, my $3.8 billion a year has helped, but even with that $3.8 billion, it's not combined with a legal requirement to serve the people who are most sick. This is systems failure, and it is the failure of law, because we know what to do. And frankly, we have more money than we've had in a long time. Under the Mental Health Services Act, it has gone from $2.1 billion in 2017 to $3.8 billion next year. You can't tell me we can take $1 billion of that, match it with a legal requirement for counties and nonprofits to get into those encampments, have the cities be required to build more shelter and housing, and that we couldn't make a bigger dent in this issue.
I want people to understand one thing before I ask Darrell the next question. When Darrell and I were serving in the assembly together, also called the golden era of the legislature, of course. But when we were serving in the legislature together, I got to tell you, there's almost no political reward in Sacramento for working on mental health, health issues generally, social service issues generally. That's not where the show horses go to get their work done. That's where the workhorses go to get their work done. And people of the state of California should be eternally grateful to you for the fine work that you have done and continue to do in that space. Let me ask about this as a possible companion concept. Let's go to the RHNA issue for a minute, if we could. Regional Housing Needs Allocation Process, and that's a bunch of government talk for the Department of Finance and the governor's office, taking a look at population projections and giving to regions in the state a number for how many very low, moderate, and above moderate income housing units they should plan for in their housing element of their general plan, which is then either certified or not certified by the Department of Housing and Community Development as adequate to be able to achieve their goals over about an 8-year planning horizon. The area where I believe most cities, and to the degree that counties participate in the unincorporated areas, but most cities and counties do a fairly decent job, except for the very low and low. That's where the big challenges are, very low and low. And what I have heard over the years in working on this issue in Santa Cruz County and in the Central Coast is nonprofit housing developers saying, you know, actually we could do very low and low, but for after we finish with density bonuses and tax credits and all the rest of it, we're still $100,000 to $200,000 per unit out from being able to pencil out the number on very low and low. So let's assume that the $100,000 to $200,000 out is a fair number. The question that I keep hearing from mayors, city council members, supervisors is there's no money for that part of it. It just isn't there. So our former speaker, Bob Hertzberg, was looking at a $35 billion affordable housing bond. And I was talking to him, and my thought was, what if you had an affordable housing bond, general obligation bond, doesn't raise taxes because it has first claim on the state's general fund, and you took $35 billion affordable housing bond. And out of that, you say, we're going to give between $100,000 and $200,000 subsidy per unit to build very low and low. Now what you've got is the ability to say to city council members, mayors, and supervisors, if you're building very low and low, we've got a source of money now. So the money issue is then off the table. Now you have all the other issues you've talked about, but the money issue is off the table. As a big city mayor, is that an attractive option to you?
Absolutely. Money is absolutely crucial if we're going to be able to provide the gap financing the way that the financing of affordable housing works. There's always has to be a local match to match the tax credits and the other sources that the nonprofit developers have. And frankly, we never have enough of it. We had $40 million in our affordable housing trust fund. We spent it down to about 3 million. And in fact, we have a big debate on May the 10th in Sacramento about whether to let a new bond indebt ourselves for 30 years to create another 100 million so that we can finance another 6, 7, 8 projects. And if there were a permanent source or an ongoing source of state funding that would substitute for that local match, that would absolutely be a game changer. But money isn't everything. It's crucial. I go back to something I said a moment ago. Do we need to think differently about what we mean by dignified and quality housing? If it's going to be $500,000 to $600,000 to $700,000 in this high-cost state to be able to subsidize a single unit of affordable housing, it begs the question, even with billions of dollars, how far do you get, given the growth in population and the severity of the crisis? Why aren't we more interested in the technology around manufactured housing? You can build houses now with 3D printers. The tiny home models are really, really interesting, not just for homeless people, but some of them are such good quality for college students, for anybody who's looking for a safe, decent place to live. I think in the state that produced the Silicon Valley, there needs to be a whole lot more innovation around housing itself to bring down the cost and to create more ready-made options that allow people a safe place to live. Because I just fear that no matter how much money you feed into the conventional machine, that it's going to leave us short volume-wise.
Is conservatorship off the table in dealing with some of the folks who are experiencing homelessness, whose issues are so severe for them that other forms of either housing or assistance or leaving them on the street or whatever, is there a role for some sort of 21st century conservatorship to come in and play a role?
It is definitely not off the table. And in fact, the governor has a very provocative proposal that is getting a lot of attention called care courts, where he would allow a family member, a outreach worker, a first responder to be able to petition the court to allow the court to provide a treatment plan for an individual that would include an obligation for the county to provide the services and for the individual to accept them short of conservatorship. I think it's a very bold proposal. I personally believe that the conservatorship laws need to be modernized, that a common sense definition of grave disability is warranted, that anybody who is living in the kind of squalor that we see, talking to themselves, obviously sick, that by definition, they should be considered gravely disabled and we should help them without any excuse. However, in the Capitol, as you know, Fred, there has been such a historic fight about this issue that is replaying itself in real time. And so here's my view of this. I'm for strengthening the conservatorship laws. And when you listen to the ACLU and Disability Rights California and some of these other groups, here's what they're really saying. And I disagree with them ideologically because they don't really want to have the conversation, but there's some truth in what they're saying. What they're saying is, why should the law make it easier to conserve somebody when there's no confidence or guarantee that the people are going to get the help and the treatment they need in the first place? What I'm trying to talk to the governor's folks about is that if you combine a right to mental health treatment with an obligation to accept it, you then, I think, bring down the temperature on the conservatorship question, maybe a little bit, because you're actually guaranteeing that the people are going to be served.
Right.
You got to deal with the distrust around the fragmentation and the broken nature of the mental health system and guarantee the care and the treatment if you're ever going to convince the powerful advocacy groups to even think about obligating the individual to accept it. That's, I think, the potential and the hope of this proposal.
Darrell, you have been very, very generous with your time. I want to speak directly to the Ollie students. Darrell Steinberg, in my estimation, is one of the finest public servants this state's ever produced. And
thank you, Fred.
The fact that you've served at the local government level, in the highest reaches of the legislature, and now big city mayor, attests to your life of public service and how committed you are. Darrell Steinberg, I love you every day, and I wish you the very best. I'll see you in Sacramento someday.
Thank you so much, Fred. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Darrell. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I want to thank the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at California State University, Monterey Bay, for their continued support of this dangling conversation about California government and politics. I appreciate the students who attend. Our very special guest today, Sacramento Mayor Darrell Steinberg. Thank all of you for participating and listening. If you've enjoyed today's broadcast, I strongly encourage you to make a donation to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at California State University, Monterey Bay. Thank you, and we will see you in the fall.